The Valley Current.
So, I want you to picture this. It is 4:31 in the morning on August 8, 2026.
Unbelievably early.
Right. The rest of Washington, D.C. is just completely fast asleep, but the United States Senate floor is, well, totally paralyzed.
Yeah, locked in this incredibly intense standoff.
Exactly. A razor-thin 50-49 vote to confirm the next Attorney General. And to win this single solitary confirmation vote, the administration has just surrendered this massive, highly controversial $1.77 billion settlement fund.
Which is a staggering amount of money to just, give up at the final hour.
It is. But here is the secret that the headlines completely missed. That fund.
Yep.
It was already legally dead.
Yeah, it was a total phantom.
Right. So today we are diving deep for you, our listeners who really love getting past the noise. We're unpacking the underlying mechanics of a political strategy that literally trades a ghost for a cabinet seat.
It's just a remarkable moment to deconstruct. I mean, what we are looking at today is this highly detailed legal and political analysis from the CLG Technology and IP briefing, and this is dated August 10th, 2026.
Hot off the presses, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And the briefing attempts to quantify something that usually just feels like political weather, right? It looks at the second term of Donald Trump's administration, specifically examining whether the strategy of relentless, almost mechanical persistence is actually yielding tangible dividends.
And of course, at what cost?
Right, because there's always a cost.
Absolutely. And before we really get into the gears of how this machinery works, I need to make a firm commitment to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is super important.
It really is. The sources we're analyzing today contain deeply politically charged analysis. I mean, they cover perspectives that span the entire ideological spectrum, detailing both left-wing and right-wing arguments.
Yeah, we are not taking any sides today.
We are absolutely not taking any sides today. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content, but simply impartially reporting on the ideas and data contained in this original source material.
Our objective is purely analytical. We just want to break down the mechanics, the data, and, the legal architecture of what the CLG briefing is presenting.
Which is exactly the lens the briefing itself uses, right?
It is. In fact, to frame this entire analysis of constitutional law and executive power, the briefing doesn't actually start with a quote from a Supreme Court justice or some constitutional framer.
Which you'd expect.
Yeah, you totally would. But it actually starts with Ray Krofrock.
The McDonald's guy.
The very same. The man who built the McDonald's empire. Kroc famously said, and I'll just quote this directly, "Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education alone will not. The world is full of educated derelicts."
Wow. Okay.
He finishes it by saying, "Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent."
Omnipotent. That's a huge word to throw around. So really the central question for this deep dive is, does that fast food business philosophy, just brute force persistence, actually translate to the highest levels of the federal government?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to answer that, we have to go all the way back to that 4:31 a.m. Senate vote.
Yeah, the capstone event.
Right. That's what the briefing uses to illustrate this strategy in real time. We are talking about the confirmation of Todd Blanche as the 88th Attorney General.
And that specific 4:31 a.m. timestamp is incredibly revealing. I mean, in Senate mechanics, middle-of-the-night votes are reserved for absolute procedural grinds.
They aren't doing that for fun.
No, absolutely not. This was not a smooth, bipartisan rubber stamp. It was a war of attrition. And to understand why it was such a brutal fight, you really have to look at the personnel churn that put Todd Blanche in that chair in the first place.
Right, because his background isn't exactly standard for an AG.
Not at all. This is an attorney who, back in 2023, was hired as Donald Trump's lead personal criminal defense lawyer.
Right. He was the lead counsel in the 2024 New York hush money trial.
Exactly.
So you're taking someone whose primary function was shielding a private citizen from state felony charges and maneuvering him into the highest law enforcement position in the entire country.
It's quite the pivot.
Yeah. How does the administration mechanically get him from point A to point B?
Well, it was through a very calculated sequence of elevations. So in March 2025, Blanche is confirmed as Deputy Attorney General.
And that was a strict party line vote, right?
Yep, strictly down the line. Then we fast forward to April 2026. The acting Attorney General at the time is Pam Bondi.
Okay.
And suddenly, she is just forced out. The president announces her removal on Truth Social.
Just like that. Did he give a reason?
None. He praises her service, says she did a great job, but offers absolutely no specific articulated reason for her dismissal. And instantly, by the sheer line of succession, Todd Blanche is elevated to acting attorney general.
Wow. So that maneuver essentially sets the stage for the August confirmation fight.
Precisely.
But, I mean, the Senate doesn't just hand over the title. They don't just say, sure, keep the job. And this is where the story turns into, like, a legal thriller for me.
Oh, it really does.
The massive hurdle blocking Blanche's confirmation was this entity called the Anti-Weaponization Fund.
Yeah.
What exactly is this fund? Because the mechanics of it sound almost surreal when you read it.
It's wild. The DOJ had issued a press release claiming this fund was set to receive $1.776 billion.
And you just have to appreciate the patriotic branding of that number, 1776.
Oh, yeah, definitely not a coincidence. And this money was supposedly part of an IRS settlement regarding the leak of Trump's tax returns.
But where does a $1.7 billion settlement even pull from? Like, where is that cash sitting?
That is the crucial detail here. It was designed to pull from the U.S. Treasury's Judgment Fund.
Okay, remind me how the Judgment Fund works.
Sure. So the Judgment Fund is this permanent, indefinite appropriation created by Congress back in the 1950s. It exists basically to pay out monetary awards against the United States when a federal agency loses a lawsuit.
Okay, so it's taxpayer money meant for when the government messes up.
Exactly. So the administration was essentially attempting to route $1.776 billion out of this taxpayer-funded Treasury account, completely bypassing standard congressional appropriations.
Under the guise of settling a civil dispute over IRS leaks.
You got it.
And obviously, the Senate balked at that. I mean, the briefing notes that Republican senators, specifically John Cornyn of Texas and Tom Tillis of North Carolina, both huge heavyweights on the Judiciary Committee, they demanded this fund be explicitly killed.
Yeah, they were not having it.
They basically refused to advance Blanche's nomination without written assurances that the Treasury wasn't about to be tapped for this billion-dollar bespoke fund.
Correct. And interestingly enough, they actually received those assurances.
They did.
Yeah. Just days before the vote, on August 2, Blanche submits a formal written statement to the Senate. He declares that the order establishing the fund is rescinded and shall have no force or effect.
Oh, okay.
And simultaneously, the DOJ issues a secondary statement severely narrowing the scope of audit protections down to just Donald Trump, 2 of his sons, and the Trump Organization.
Okay, here is where I really have to pause, because the timeline of the judicial pushback changes the entire complexion of this supposed concession.
Oh, totally.
Because the briefing points out that U.S. District Judge Kathleen M. Williams had already looked at this fund.
She had.
She examined the underlying lawsuit and completely dismantled it. I mean, she ruled that it was, quote, brought for an improper purpose.
Yeah, her wording was pretty scathing.
She explicitly wrote that the administration was trying to gain the imprimatur of judicial legitimacy for a settlement that had no viable basis in law or fact.
Yes. Judge Williams basically ruled that the legal foundation for accessing the Judgment Fund in this specific manner fundamentally did not exist.
Right.
The structural mechanism they were trying to use to authorize that $1.776 billion was, in the eyes of the federal judiciary, entirely invalid from the very start.
So wait, if Judge Williams has already ruled that the legal foundation is a phantom, how is rescinding it a real concession?
That's the million, or I guess billion-dollar question.
Like, it feels like paying off a mortgage with monopoly money.
Yeah.
Or like a corporate negotiation where you concede a patent, expired 10 years ago, but you demand the corner office in exchange.
That's a great analogy.
Right. You're trading zero value for extremely high value. So is this an actual legislative compromise or just a strategic illusion to get Blanche confirmed?
Well, that specific tension is the genius or, the systemic danger, depending entirely on your institutional perspective of this persistence strategy.
Okay, break that down for me.
The CLG analysis argues this is the exact playbook in motion. You create a maximalist, legally dubious policy vehicle, like a $1.7 billion fund drawing on the Treasury.
Make it huge so everyone has to look at it.
Exactly. You force everyone to react to it. You endure the legal backlash, the judicial rebukes, all of the friction, but you just hold that ground until the precise moment it becomes a liability for a larger institutional objective.
Which in this case is securing the attorney general's seat.
Right. And then you, quote unquote, negotiate it away. You concede a chess piece that the judiciary had already functionally taken off the board anyway. And in return, you capture the king.
Man. That reframes the entire 431 AM vote. It wasn't just a messy negotiation, it was a highly targeted tactical sacrifice.
Very targeted.
And that bridges perfectly into the broader framework the briefing lays out. Because this strategy isn't just a series of happy accidents or lucky breaks. It's calculated.
Highly calculated.
The briefing actually dedicates a whole game theory sidebar to break down how this war of attrition functions mathematically. So let's dig into that architecture.
Yeah, the game theory section is fascinating. It synthesizes the strategy into 4 distinct pillars. The first pillar is commitment.
Okay, commitment.
Right. In standard political models, if an administration loses a major court case, they usually accept the defeat, regroup, maybe draft some new legislation.
They lick their wounds and move on.
Exactly. But the persistence strategy completely rejects that premise.
Yeah.
It refuses to treat a judicial loss as final. A loss is merely, the end of round 1.
Which has to fundamentally alter the psychology of the opponent.
Oh, entirely.
Because if I'm an advocacy group and I defeat a policy in court, I expect the fight to be over. But under this model, the administration just shows up the next morning with version 2.
Which leads directly to the second pillar. Reputation. By establishing this relentless willingness to relitigate, reissue orders, and constantly appeal, you radically alter the cost-benefit analysis for anyone opposing you.
Because they know you'll never stop.
Right. Opponents realize that defeating a measure once is legally meaningless. They have to secure the funding, the lawyers, and the political capital to defeat it 5 times over.
You essentially raise the cost of resistance so high that it becomes prohibitive.
Exactly. You bankrupt them, either financially or energetically.
But they aren't just blindly bashing their heads against a brick wall, right? Like, they aren't just submitting the exact same broken document over and over.
No, and that brings us to the third pillar, which is iteration.
Iteration, okay.
Iteration means updating the strategy after every single loss. You probe the judicial opinions, you find the specific legal weaknesses the judges cited, you tweak the configuration of the executive order, and you launch it again.
You keep turning the dial.
Exactly. You turn the dial until the courts or the Senate finally accept it. And all of this, by the way, is only possible because of the fourth pillar, which is perhaps the most critical of all.
Which is?
Asymmetric stakes.
Let's explore that term. When we say asymmetric stakes, we're talking about a massive power imbalance, right?
Massive.
It's like a gambler playing against the casino house. The gambler might win a few hands, but eventually they just run out of chips. The house has infinite chips.
That is a highly accurate analogy for the federal legal system. A repeat player, in this case the executive branch, has access to the sprawling apparatus of the Department of Justice.
Thousands of lawyers.
Right. A virtually bottomless legal budget, and the structural advantage of time. They can easily absorb individual litigation losses that would completely exhaust a one-shot opponent.
Because a state attorney general or a civil rights nonprofit has finite resources.
Exactly. Waging a multi-year, multi-jurisdictional legal war will bankrupt them. But the federal government simply absorbs the friction.
And the briefing uses a very specific historical example to prove how these 4 pillars work in reality, right? The travel ban from the first term.
Yes, it's the perfect case study.
Walk us through how that played out, because it really is the textbook model for this iteration concept.
So the sequence of the travel ban perfectly maps onto the game theory we just discussed. In January 2017, the administration issues Executive Order 1.0.
And it was chaos.
Complete chaos. It is immediately met with protests at the airports and quickly enjoined by federal courts. Now, a traditional administration might retreat at that point.
Right, take the L.
But instead, they iterate. They issue version 2.0 in March 2017. That is also enjoined and eventually rendered moot, but they keep the commitment.
So they go back to the drawing board again.
Yep. They adjust the legal justifications. They add waiver processes to satisfy specific judicial complaints they saw in the rulings. And they issue version 3.0 Proclamation 9645 in September 2017.
And that third version makes it all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yes, and the court upholds it. In Trump v. Hawaii in 2018, Chief Justice Roberts writes the 5-4 majority opinion, legally validating the third iteration.
Wow.
It proved definitively that if you iterate, adjust, and persist long long enough, you can eventually find the specific legal configuration that a majority of the Supreme Court is willing to accept.
That makes logical sense for policies working their way through the standard multi-year court process. But the briefing takes a fascinating turn here.
It really does.
Because it notes that the administration isn't just relying on full merits hearings anymore. There is an entirely different battlefield they are dominating, and that's the shadow docket, or the emergency docket.
Yes, this is crucial.
The briefing pulls data from Georgetown law professor Steve Vladek and UC Davis's Vikram Amar, and the statistics are just jarring. I mean, Bloomberg Law cites a 78% win rate for the administration on the emergency docket between January 2025 and January 2026.
Which is incredibly high.
NBC News cites 72%. Professor Amar has it as high as roughly 92% in 2025.
Yeah, to understand the weight of those numbers, we really have to explain the mechanics of the shadow docket.
Please do.
In a normal legal process, a lawsuit is filed. There is a lengthy period of discovery where evidence is gathered. There are lower court rulings, circuit court appeals, and finally, years later, the Supreme Court might grant certiorari and hear the case on the merits.
The standard law and order timeline.
Right. But the emergency docket bypasses almost all of that.
Right, because it's meant for emergencies. It's a mechanism for the government to say, hey, if you don't pause this lower court ruling right now, the country will suffer irreversible damage.
Precisely. The administration goes to the Supreme Court and requests an emergency stay of a lower court injunction. If granted, the administration's policy is allowed to go into effect immediately while the years-long underlying litigation plays out.
So they win the practical fight today, even if they lose the legal argument 3 years from now.
Exactly. By front-loading their legal strategy onto this emergency docket and winning at a 78 to 92% clip, the administration is effectively implementing their agenda in real time, regardless of what the lower courts say.
See, I have to push back on this, though.
Go for it.
If you look at those numbers, a 92% win rate in a legal system where a standard trial outcome is often just a coin toss, how is that even statistically possible unless the rules of the game itself have changed?
That's the debate.
Like, is this iteration strategy just a fancy academic term for throwing legal spaghetti at the wall until it sticks? If you are constantly losing on the actual merits in the lower courts, but you're securing victories on the emergency docket via procedural stays, aren't you just exploiting procedural loopholes?
It's a very fair question.
Is that effective legal strategy, or is it institutional gaming?
You have isolated the exact core debate consuming legal scholars right now, and the CLG briefing meticulously presents both sides of it.
Okay, what are the two sides saying?
Well, the effective iteration camp looks at those numbers and sees sophisticated elite lawyering. They argue that the administration simply understands the modern mechanics of the federal courts better than their opponents do.
They just read the rulebook more closely.
Right. They know how to vehicle shop. They understand the precise legal triggers that activate the Supreme Court's emergency powers, and they just aggressively utilize the rules as written.
So to them, it's just playing the game at a grandmaster level.
Correct. But the institutional erosion camp argues exactly what you just articulated. They contend that this is a systematic exploitation of procedural mechanisms that were designed exclusively for rare actual emergencies.
It's like a last-minute death penalty stay.
Exactly. Things that can't wait. They argue it is being weaponized as a shortcut to bypass standard judicial review, discovery, and lower court fact-finding.
Which fundamentally changes how justice works.
Yes. We will dive much deeper into the institutional cost of that tension later, but the briefing absolutely acknowledges it as a highly valid concern.
Okay, so we've established the playbook. We've got the war of attrition, the game theory of iteration, and this mastery of the emergency docket. Now we really need to look at the trophy case.
The results.
Right. What has this 6-year relentless persistence actually secured? Because the concrete victories cataloged in this briefing are massive. Let's start with the judiciary, because those numbers basically dictate the landscape for decades.
They do.
In the first term, they confirmed 234 Article 3 judges.
Let's define what an Article 3 judge is, just for context.
Yeah, good idea.
These are federal judges appointed under Article 3 of the Constitution, meaning they have lifetime tenure. They are the district court judges who hold the trials, the circuit court judges who hear initial appeals, and of course, the Supreme Court justices.
Right, lifetime appointments.
Exactly. So confirming 234 of them in a single term is a generational reshaping of the federal bench. That figure includes 54 circuit judges, 174 district judges, and of course, 3 Supreme Court justices.
And the briefing actually makes a point to tie that very first Supreme Court seat back to the theme of persistence, right?
It does. It explicitly traces Neil Gorsuch's confirmation back to the 2016 blockade of Merrick Garland.
Oh, right.
That blockade was an unprecedented high-stakes gamble of political persistence by Senate Republicans. It required enduring massive public and institutional friction, but it paid off immensely by holding a vacancy open for the incoming administration.
Now, looking at the second term, the judicial confirmations have slowed down significantly. As of mid-2026, they've confirmed roughly 34 Article III judges, that's 6th Circuit and 28 District.
The briefing attributes that slower pace primarily to a structural reality. There are simply fewer inherited vacancies this time around.
Right, the seats are full.
Yeah, the low-hanging fruit was harvested in the first term, and crucially, there have been no second-term Supreme Court vacancies yet.
But while the judicial appointments might have slowed, the personal legal comebacks have accelerated in a way that is, it's almost hard to comprehend.
It's unprecedented.
Let's wind the clock back to 2023 and 2024. There were 4 massive historic criminal cases hanging over Donald Trump.
Yeah.
You had the New York State hush money trial. You had the federal January 6th election interference case in D.C. You had the federal classified documents case in Florida. And you had the Georgia Fulton County Aria Goat case.
A huge legal web.
Huge. The briefing methodically walks through how the persistence strategy systematically neutralized essentially all of them.
The mechanics of how those cases unraveled is honestly a masterclass in legal attrition. Let's just trace the timeline. In July 2024, Judge Aileen Cannon completely dismisses the federal classified documents case in Florida, ruling that the appointment of special counsel Jack Smith was unconstitutional.
Which is a massive structural victory right out of the gate.
Huge. Then, the administration secures the 2024 electoral victory, which the briefing rightfully identifies as the absolute centerpiece of the entire persistence narrative.
Because everything flows from regaining the executive branch.
Exactly. Regaining the executive branch completely changes the DOJ protocols.
Right. Because following the election on November 25, 2024, Special Counsel Jack Smith moves to dismiss the federal election interference case in D.C.
Citing the long-standing Department of Justice policy that a sitting president cannot be criminally prosecuted.
And then in Georgia, the Fulton County case basically collapses under the weight of ethical controversies.
Right. District Attorney Fani Willis is disqualified in December 2024, and the entire prosecution is formally dropped by November 2025.
Which just leaves the New York State conviction, because he was convicted in May 2024 on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records.
Yes.
Now, in January 2025, he was sentenced to an unconditional discharge with no penalty. But the conviction itself is still officially on the books. How does the administration handle a state-level conviction that the DOJ can't touch because they can't pardon a state crime?
They handle it through the appellate process, utilizing a major Supreme Court precedent. The conviction is currently pending appeal, and his legal team is aggressively invoking absolute immunity.
Okay.
They are arguing that faulty evidence regarding his official acts was improperly admitted during the trial, which they say taints the entire conviction.
And they can make that argument because of Trump v. United States. The briefing positions this July 1st, 2024 Supreme Court ruling as arguably the foundational payoff of the entire persistence strategy.
It is the bedrock. In a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice Roberts, the Supreme Court granted absolute immunity to the president for core constitutional acts and presumptive immunity for all other official acts.
Which fundamentally and permanently altered the landscape of presidential accountability.
Completely. It provides a retroactive shield for the first term and a proactive shield for the second term.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And what is critical to understand is that they aren't just using this legal machinery for personal defense.
No, not at all.
The briefing details how they are utilizing the exact same persistence to aggressively expand executive power over the administrative state itself.
Right.
The clearest example is a case called Trump v. Slaughter, decided on June 29, 2026. This was another 6-3 decision that overruled a precedent known as Humphrey's executor. Now, for our listeners who aren't steeped in 1930s administrative law, what is Humphrey's executor and why does killing it matter?
Humphrey's executor was this landmark 1935 Supreme Court case that emerged during Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration.
FDR.
Right. Roosevelt tried to fire a conservative commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission, William Humphrey, simply because Humphrey opposed the New Deal. The Supreme Court ruled against FDR, establishing that the president cannot fire the heads of independent regulatory agencies, like the FTC or the SEC, without cause.
You mean the president can't just fire them because of a policy disagreement? They have to have actually committed malfeasance or neglected their duties.
Right. And that for-cause removal protection became the bedrock of the modern independent administrative state. It allowed agencies to regulate industries without the constant threat of the president just firing them on a whim.
Okay, so it gave them independence.
Exactly. But the ruling in Trump v. Slaughter dismantles that bedrock. The 6-3 majority ruled that for-cause removal protections are unconstitutional, meaning the president now has the direct authority to fire the heads of these independent agencies at will.
But the truly fascinating part is how the administration achieved this. Because they didn't just wait around for a disgruntled FTC commissioner to sue them.
You know, they did not.
According to the briefing, they engineered the entire confrontation. The DOJ fired FTC officials in March 2025, specifically to provoke a lawsuit.
Yes, exactly.
They intentionally manufactured the test case, forced the federal courts to address it, escalated it to the Supreme Court, and secured the exact ruling they wanted.
It is an incredibly proactive, aggressive use of executive authority. I mean, they identified a 90-year-old precedent that constrained their power, designed a legal vehicle to challenge it, and drove it straight to a Supreme Court they knew was sympathetic to the unitary executive theory.
And they applied that exact same grinding persistence to the legislative branch, too.
They did.
We all remember the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from the first term. The briefing highlights how they locked that in during the second term with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law on July 4th, 2025.
Right, making those cuts permanent.
Exactly, which secures an estimated $4.5 trillion in tax reductions. But look at the sheer mechanical difficulty of passing this. In the Senate, it passed 51-50, requiring Vice President J.D. Vance to cast the tie-breaking vote.
Barely squeezed through.
And in the House, it was 218 to 214.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you start to see the exact same methodology operating across entirely different theaters of government simultaneously.
Yes, because passing a $4.5 trillion fiscal package with a one-vote margin in both chambers is a monumental feat of political whipping.
It is.
It requires keeping every single faction in line, enduring the procedural delays, and refusing to abandon the bill when negotiations stall. They just persisted through the razor-thin margins.
Precisely. And it doesn't stop at domestic policy either.
Right.
The briefing touches on how this operates in foreign policy as well. During the first term, the Abraham Accords utilized persistent diplomatic pressure to create a verified normalization framework between Israel and several Arab states.
Right, grinding diplomacy.
And in the second term, the briefing points to the 20-point Gaza plan introduced in September 2025, which led to a ceasefire in October. Though, it is important to note the briefing acknowledges the implementation of that ceasefire is highly contested. You also have the Iran strikes designated Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, where, again, damage assessments conflict. But across the board, whether in federal courts, the halls of Congress, or foreign theaters, the administration applies this relentless pressure to force outcomes.
Okay, so the strategy yields undeniable results. But as the briefing explores, the machinery isn't flawless.
No, it's not.
The spaghetti doesn't always stick. The entire concept of a war of attrition relies on overwhelming the system. But what happens when the institutional system pushes back? Because there are hard legal limits, and the data in this briefing shows exactly where they are.
We absolutely do see those limits. The most glaring example of a hard institutional boundary in the second term revolves around trade policy and tariffs.
Okay, let's look at that.
The briefing details the Term 2 Liberation Day, reciprocal, and fentanyl tariffs. The administration attempted to implement these sweeping tariffs using authority under IEPA.
Let's define IEPA really quickly. That's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, correct?
Yes, exactly. It is a statute passed in 1977 that grants the president broad authority to regulate commerce, but only after declaring a national emergency in response to an unusual and extraordinary foreign threat.
Like terrorism.
Historically, yes, it's been used for targeted sanctions like freezing the assets of foreign terrorists or rogue states. But the administration attempted to use this national emergency authority to impose broad tariffs on fentanyl precursor chemicals and reciprocal trade imbalances.
And the Supreme Court stepped in and said no.
A hard no.
This is the case of Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump, decided on February 28, 2026. It is another 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice Roberts, but this time the ruling is against the administration.
A major loss.
The court ruled that IEPA does not authorize these types of sweeping tariffs. They held the tariffs unlawful ab initio, meaning they were void from the very beginning as if they never existed. And the government was actually ordered to issue massive refunds to the importers. It's a spectacular legal reversal.
It serves as a vital data point. It demonstrates that even a repeat player strategy, even one operating in front of a Supreme Court heavily shaped by the administration itself, will eventually encounter immovable legal walls. The court is essentially saying you cannot stretch a 1977 emergency statute infinitely to cover standard economic policy.
But here is what I find fascinating. It goes right back to the game theory of iteration we talked about earlier.
Right.
The briefing notes that on the exact same day the Supreme Court struck down the IEPA tariffs, February 20, the administration instantly terminated them and immediately imposed 10% Section 122 tariffs, while signaling they were prepping Section 301 and 232 pathways as well.
Instant pivot.
If they pivoted the very same afternoon the ruling came down, they had to have anticipated the loss. What does this say about their planning cycles? They didn't even pause to regroup. They just flipped a switch.
It strongly suggests highly sophisticated legal anticipation and contingency modeling. I mean, the administration's lawyers likely modeled the legal risk of the IEPA strategy, recognized it was highly vulnerable at the Supreme Court, and proactively drafted the Section 122 alternative.
They had it pre-positioned.
Yes. This is what the briefing identifies as simultaneous reversal and persistence. The specific vehicle they were using, the IEPA authority, crashed into a wall. But the administration didn't stop the policy. They simply switched to a different statutory vehicle and kept driving toward the exact same economic goal.
So the tool changes, but the objective remains untouched. But the briefing highlights another area of pushback where they couldn't just switch tools. They actually hit a roadblock that forced them to stop entirely. And this involves the Federal Reserve.
Yes, the case of Trump v. Cook. This is incredibly revealing regarding how the Supreme Court views executive power. The decision in Cook came down on June 29, 2026.
Wait, June 29, 2026. That is the exact same day they won the Slaughter case, overruling Humphrey's executor for the FTC.
Exactly. On the very same day, the Supreme Court handed down 2 decisions regarding the president's power to fire independent agency heads. In Slaughter, they gave the president the power to fire FTC officials at will. But in Cook, they issued a stay blocking the administration from removing Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook.
So the Supreme Court is looking at the president and saying, you have total authority over consumer protection and trade regulation, but you cannot touch the entity that controls the global dollar. Why the distinction? If for-cause removal is unconstitutional for one, why not the other?
Because the court is engaging in a highly calibrated institutional balancing rather than offering blanket deference to the executive branch. They are establishing a constitutional floor.
Hard boundary.
Right. The 6-3 court is willing to dismantle the administrative state in areas of domestic regulation, but they draw a hard, bright red line around monetary policy. They view the independence of the Federal Reserve, and by extension, the stability of the U.S. dollar and global financial markets, as an untouchable institutional necessity.
It's a fascinating boundary. And the briefing also reminds us of legacy failures from the first term, proving that persistence doesn't mathematically guarantee victory.
No, it doesn't.
We all remember the failed ACA repeal and replace effort in 2017, culminating in Senator John McCain's famous thumbs-down vote on the Senate floor. And the briefing points to the 2020 election challenges, where the campaign filed over 60 lawsuits and won roughly 1 minor procedural victory. No amount of legal iteration or persistence turned those specific efforts into wins.
Which brings us to the most critical pivot in the entire CLG analysis. We have documented the legal wins, the legislative margins, and the judicial reversals. But we have to address the human and institutional costs.
The hidden toll.
Right. Even when the persistence strategy successfully secures a victory, what is the collateral damage of waging a 6-year war of attrition against your own government's institutions?
Right. Because this is where the counter-narrative enters the briefing at full strength.
Yeah.
The document outlines what it calls the institutional erosion camp.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the judiciary itself.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Justice Elena Kagan's dissent in the Slaughter case. She is sounding a massive alarm.
A huge alarm.
She explicitly warns that the emergency docket is being systematically weaponized to transfer authority away from Congress and consolidate it within the presidency.
And independent legal organizations are echoing that alarm. The Brennan Center for Justice adds a crucial layer to this analysis, arguing that the Supreme Court has silently but fundamentally changed its standards for granting emergency stays.
How so?
Traditionally, to get an emergency stay, the government had to meet an incredibly high bar. They had to prove concrete, irreparable harm would occur if the lower court ruling wasn't paused.
Like actual disaster would strike.
Right. But the Brennan Center argues that the court is now routinely granting relief without requiring that rigorous proof, effectively lowering the bar for the executive branch to bypass normal procedures.
And then you have the NYU Tax Law Center analyzing the Todd Blanche confirmation.
Oh, this is a great point.
Remember, the written assurance Blanche gave to the Senate, promising the $1.776 billion anti-weaponization fund, was dead. The NYU experts reviewed that and stated those assurances were, quote, not worth the paper they're written on, simply because the settlement didn't have a valid legal foundation in the first place.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important institutional question of all. Are we losing the presumption of regularity at the Department of Justice?
Explain what the presumption of regularity means in this context, because that sounds like a big deal.
It is a massive deal. In the American legal system, there is a bedrock doctrine that when a government official, especially from the DOJ, makes representation to a judge or to Congress, there is a presumption that their statement is legally sound, thoroughly vetted, and negotiated in good faith.
They assume the government isn't lying or making things up.
Exactly. The courts assume the government is telling the truth about the law. When outside experts, law centers, and federal judges begin routinely declaring that DOJ settlements and legal filings have absolutely no basis in law or fact, that presumption erodes.
And once that trust is gone...
Right. When the presumption of regularity decays, the foundational trust required for the justice system to function begins to collapse.
And the briefing makes it clear that this decay isn't just an academic concern isolated to law schools and courtrooms. It is actively bleeding into the public square.
Yes, the public is feeling it.
The analysis includes Table 4, which tracks Gallup polling data, and the public cost of this strategy is stark. Let's look at the numbers. During the second-term inauguration period in January 2025, the administration's approval rating was at 47%.
Which is pretty standard.
But by November 2025, it had crashed to 36%. That is a second-term low. Disapproval hit 60%. Furthermore, there is a staggering 92-point partisan gap.
Polling data is the ultimate metric of political attrition. You can outmaneuver opponents in federal court, you can squeeze sweeping legislation through a 51-50 Senate using tiebreakers, but if the broader public feels the constant grinding strain of institutional warfare, it inevitably reflects in those approval numbers.
If we look at this purely as a political equation, the CLG analysis is pointing out a massive strategic liability. I mean, it's like a CEO celebrating record profits while 60% of the employees are actively trying to quit.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
At 36% approval, how sustainable is this? Does public opinion even matter if you have 50 senators and 6 Supreme Court justices? Because it seems like they are operating dangerously close to the edge of a cliff. If you only have 50 senators and 60% of the public disapproves of your methods, your margin for error is effectively zero.
None.
One single defection from a moderate swing state Republican who gets nervous about their re-election and the entire legislative machine breaks down.
You have isolated the exact tension the CLG analysis concludes with. The persistent strategy works independently of public popularity only as long as the Senate majority holds absolute discipline and the judicial vehicles remain viable.
But it's fragile.
Incredibly fragile. Look at the Todd Blanche confirmation. A 50-49 vote at 4.31 in the morning. They required the vice president to break a tie on their signature tax bill. The strategy is mathematically viable right now, but the friction is immense. There is absolutely no buffer.
Which brings us to the final ledger. The briefing wraps all of this data, the capstone confirmation, the 4 pillars of game theory, the judicial dominance, the tariff reversals, and the hidden institutional tolls into a carefully calibrated verdict.
Yes. The CLG analysis balances this strategy on 2 distinct axes. On the first axis, policy and personnel, the persistent strategy is a massive, undeniable, historical success.
The wins are huge.
Confirming 3 Supreme Court justices, executing a historic presidential comeback, dismantling foundational precedents like Humphrey's executor, and neutralizing 4 major criminal cases. These are objectives most administrations could only dream of achieving over 8 years, let alone the first 2 years of a second term.
But on the second axis, the institutional health axis, the costs are severe and accumulating. The learning resources tariff reversal, showing the limits of emergency powers, the Cook Federal Reserve setback, demonstrating a hard boundary on executive control.
And the public toll.
Right. A 36% public approval rating reflecting deep societal fatigue and visible friction with independent legal scholars and the foundational presumption of regularity.
So the ultimate verdict from the CLG briefing is this. Persistence has paid off substantially, but the arc of its success is not linear. The iteration strategy is beginning to encounter diminishing returns as it crashes into increasingly coordinated institutional resistance from the courts and the public.
The machine is slowing down.
Right. 6 years in, the cumulative ledger shows net success on core executive objectives, but at a steeply rising, perhaps unsustainable political and institutional cost.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
That's the real takeaway here.
The briefing concludes that your ultimate judgment of this strategy depends entirely on what you weigh more heavily in your own civic calculus. Do you prioritize the aggressive expansion of executive power and the securing of generational policy victories? Or do you prioritize institutional legitimacy, the historical norms of the justice system, and broad public support?
It's a trade-off.
It is. The mechanics of the strategy are proven to work, but the analysis makes clear it is never inevitable, and it is certainly never free.
And that leads to a deeply fascinating, provocative final thought for everyone to mull over, drawn directly from the briefing's questions for further discussion section.
I love this part.
If this strategy of relentless persistence, this mastered war of attrition, remains politically and legally viable all the way through 2028, what are the constitutional and political conditions under which a third-term bid might be theoretically pursued?
Oh, wow.
And if that ultimate boundary were tested, what would a war of attrition look like in that unprecedented scenario?
That is definitely a question that will keep you thinking long after this deep dive ends. Before we wrap, as always, led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we refer to is published in detail and readily available, commitment-free, with no paywalls or other charges. Thanks for joining us.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.